President of the Chamber, that was my prerogative to welcome all of you to this wonderful lecture that I am looking forward to hearing myself from Mr. Mittal. Paula, Sandeep, Mr. Mittal, ladies and gentlemen. Our startup committee, as you know, is one of the most important of our 45 committees in this chamber, and appropriately headed by a powerhouse, Paula Mariwala, who I can see is going to do a great job this year. She's already been doing a great job. Today I have a special job this year. Anyway, I have great pleasure and privilege in welcoming all of you to hear the Startup Founder Series organized by this committee. As you know, startup icons have etched a niche position in our economy, and you'll hear one of the most important, well-known speakers today. Personally, I am of the firm belief that the future of India lies in startups and the MSMEs. This stems from the simple observation that 5 of our most valuable companies in the world, very strong statement, 5 of the most valuable companies in the world were till recently startups. And I'll give you some statistics. Apple, 1976, the most valuable company in the world, $815 billion. Google, 1998, only 20 years ago, second most valuable company in the world, $650 billion. Facebook, started in 2004, 13 years ago, $485 billion. Then Microsoft and Amazon, so the list goes on. The fact of the matter is that the world likes startups. The world likes Mr. Mittal. So I'm looking forward to the lectures, I repeat. Though many of our startups in India are still not listed, such as Flipkart and Ola, I'm sure that they will get listed and they'll become extremely valuable in the time to come. One of the pressing needs of India is to create employment. As all of you know, we need to create 1 million jobs every month. 2 recent studies by McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group have estimated, they're very recent, 3-month-old, that India has only created about 7 million jobs in 5 years. We have created 60 million jobs, we have created only 7 million jobs, which is why you can see the Modi government is under fire a little bit now. If you see the press, there's not enough jobs for people. And therefore we do have an enormous problem. And that is why the theme of IMC this year is creating employment. The main theme of the chamber this year, creating jobs. A large number of studies done worldwide have come to the conclusion that employment is created only by startups and MSMEs. Okay, people don't believe this. The large companies don't create jobs. It's the startups and MSMEs that create jobs. So they're very, very important to us. The hotbed of technology, as all of you know, is of course Silicon Valley, which is the hotbed of all startups worldwide. But we had a lecture very recently from Israel. We are taking delegation to Israel, and Israel is another place where there are a large number of startups. Israel is a very small country, 8.5 million people, half the city of Bombay. But the fact of the matter is that they have a very, very large number of startups in that country. Today, I believe the estimate is that we have 4,400 technology startups. And thanks to people like Mr. Mittal, the estimate is this will become 12,000, which is very, very important for this country, in my opinion. And investors such as SoftBank, which have now a $100 billion technology fund, are investing heavily into India. And all of you read in the press, they've already invested over $2 billion. And I think the figure will increase with the $100 billion to give away. So those who want it, talk to SoftBank. They have all the money to give. Prime Minister Modi is stressing on empowering the nation by giving the right thrust to startups by starting up India, intended to build a strong ecosystem for nurturing innovation and startups in the country to drive sustainable economic growth and generate, of course, employment. The Startup Committee of IMC with Paula, our energetic chairperson, as you know, has lined up very exciting and knowledge-sharing events which should build both startups and are also equally important to angel investors. who are looking for good startups to give money away. And we already held, or she already held, a highly successful angel investor masterclass, she and Sandeep here, as the very first event of the startup committee this year. The startup series is designed to motivate young budding startups like you, for motivating them to become successful entrepreneurs. The highlight would be the business journey and the various situations faced by them and how they conquered it. I must tell you, since I'm an MIT alumnus, and Paula, of course, comes from a better institute, Stanford, but the MIT alumnus have started companies which contribute to 15% of US GDP. So startups is extremely important to all economies. And we have, who else better than Anupam Mittal, to founder and CEO of People Group and of the famous Shadi.com and Makan.com. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. He started his entrepreneurial journey by founding People Group, which includes, of course, Shadi.com and Makan.com, but a variety of other companies which we'll talk about. And the group is recognized as one of the most innovative enterprises in the country. Besides his operational role, Anupam is also an angel investor and has made over 75 investments, most of which I believe have done extremely well. I have a whole list of 75, but I can't read them out right now. You can see he's a true entrepreneur. He's passionate about entrepreneurship and innovation and well regarded and esteemed for his understanding of the subject. He has been voted by Business Week as one of India's most influential people and is consistently ranked among the top icons in India's digital ecosystem. So I am delighted that we have a wonderful speaker today. I'll spend 2 minutes talking about Indian Merchant Chamber. I'm doing a sales job now because I want all of you to become members. Those of you who are not, please join IMC. But let me tell you in 2 minutes what we are all about. This chamber was established in 1907, 110 years ago. This building belongs to us, strategically located, foundation stone laid by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. So it's an iconic building. The only chamber in which Mahatma Gandhi was an honorary member. He joined no other chamber, but he joined IMC. Virtually every president and prime minister of India have addressed this chamber, have graced this chamber. This is a very iconic room. You can see the statues around us. So you are sitting in a very, very special room right now. Mr. Narendra Modi, our present prime minister, has addressed this chamber twice, in 2013 and very recently in April 2017. We are the voice over 2 lakh corporates, so which gives us the power that we have. 2 of our recent very active members and chairman of our committees like Paula have now become union cabinet ministers. So Paula can become a union cabinet minister hopefully. Suresh Prabhu and Piyush Goyal, very active in the chamber and chairman of our committees. And because of the strength that we have unparalleled reach to both union and state governments. So I think I invite all of you. Our fee is very modest, but they tell you what it is, a few thousand rupees. And we look forward to your joining this. Those who have not become members of IMC. Before I conclude, I must tell you I have a medical appointment, so I leave at 5:30. So I won't be rude, Anupam, but my doctor won't wait, unfortunately. So up to 5:30 I'm here. And now I'd like to hand it over to Paula and then invite, of course, Anupam to speak to you. Paula.
Thank you, Dr. Kanodia. Welcome everybody on this lovely afternoon. And on behalf of the Startup Committee, it's my pleasure to kick off what we are calling the Founder Series, where we're going to really salute entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. As Dr. Kanodia mentioned, if you look around these hallowed walls, we see stalwarts who have not only built companies, but they've contributed to nation building. So it is really the spirit of entrepreneurship and organization building that IMC is built on. And in that spirit, we really want to take forward entrepreneurship in the current context by really engaging with what is driving the economy, what is really driving the new ecosystem. And entrepreneurship is all about creation. It's about creating something that will outlast the founder. And like any creative process, entrepreneurship is a journey. the journey of the creator, the motivation, the passion, the gamut of emotions that the entrepreneur experiences in this journey. It is actually, that's what really leaves behind a lasting legacy. We recognize these founders not only for the size of their balance sheets or the scale of their brand or the reach, but it is really for the resolve and resilience of these entrepreneurs, the passion and the perseverance that they have to face during this journey, and the humility and the vision that they bring to the ecosystem. And this is what really makes a founder different than a simple businessman. So, as part of the startup committee, we thought we must invite such people who have disrupted businesses, who have disrupted the norm by coming out with something innovative that has really changed how we do stuff, how we enjoy life, how we transact, how we do healthcare, how we get married. So, keeping that in mind, we are going to, through the year, invite people, like Dr. said, like Mr. Mittal, and many others who are building not just businesses or organizations, but they are actually leaving a legacy and are an inspiration for many of us, a lot of new young entrepreneurs or innovators who want to find that big idea and, create something different and impact the society. So, if we look back, for centuries there have been inflection points in histories, whether it's the automobile replacing the horse cart, or the telegraph or the telephony changing the way we communicate, or aviation changing the way we travel. These inflection points or these innovations or these inventors, they actually disrupt the world and throw open windows of opportunities which a few of them grab. And they throw up entrepreneurs like Henry Ford, Edison, and so many others. One such inflection point happened in 1995 when the World Wide Web came to us and we got connected through the internet. And this threw up opportunities for people who recognized that this would really change the way we do business across the globe. And today, if you look around, again, Dr. Kanodia mentioned several companies which are the most valuable companies in the world. And they're so ubiquitous. We cannot imagine life. You cannot find, today I was trying to find a restaurant in Ford. I could not have done so without Google Maps. You want to reach anybody anytime, you on Facebook, Instagram, so on, right? So these are so ubiquitous. We cannot imagine life without them. And all this changed with that one inflection point in 1995. And those who understood the opportunities that they created, really created something that has impacted the entire world and will continue to do so at a furious pace as we go along. So one such entrepreneur who grabbed this opportunity way back, about 20 years ago, I would say, was Anupam. And Anupam was in the US when the internet started in 1995. But coming from a traditional Marwari family, he sensed an opportunity that few others could see. And he's going to talk more about it. But let me just tell you that, the company he created, Shadi.com, he's been able to touch, and Anupam, correct me if I'm wrong, because this could be dated numbers, but he's got 3 million shadis done through this portal that he started quite a few years ago. I mean, that beats most of our pundits that we know. And he's touched, I think, almost 20 million consumers. So that's the power of the internet, but I think it's the power of the idea and the power of the execution. And, we're going to get a flavor of this through, about his journey, about all the challenges he faced, about the highs and lows, and about what he sees next, what is the next big idea that's going to change the world. Besides being a great entrepreneur, again, like Dr. Kanodia said, an entrepreneur can always recognize opportunities, and another opportunity in today's world is that of grabbing other startups. So just as he makes good matches, I think he makes good investments. He's prolific and one of the early angel entrepreneurs in India. He has a large portfolio, And I've heard some good things from entrepreneurs about how he manages the portfolio, how he inspires the entrepreneurs, and gives them guidance where required. He's an early investor in Ola, for example, which all of us know well, Dhruva, beat out very many different companies, and he is really contributing immensely to the vibrant startup ecosystem in our country, with his own experiences, with his own vision, and by really investing time and money into the ecosystem, and for which we're very thankful, Anupam, that you're here today to share and again can inspire some more entrepreneurs and innovators. And to get some good stories out of him, we have Sandeep Singhal, our co-chair of the Startup Committee. He's a veteran venture capitalist, has been around for a while, so has seen things change. Both Anupam and Sandeep, when they became active in the startup ecosystem in the early 2000s, we had 7 million internet users in India. We had 5 million mobile user subscribers. Today the number, I believe, is 250 million, expected to be by 500 million by 2018 as internet users. And as you all know, we have 1 billion mobile subscribers and 300 million smartphones. So in this short span of 15 years, we have certainly seen some changes. And both Sandeep and Anupam have lived through these changes, have cashed in on some of these changes, and have created opportunities, have invested in opportunities. So, some of us cannot remember, cannot even understand a time when there were no smartphones. Some of you younger people who I see, but they actually invested in companies or created companies when, things were not actually so transparently obvious that, okay, everybody will do everything through the net or through the phone. So where is their third eye? How did they see all this? So hopefully, Sandeep, you will get Anupam to decode some of that and share with us what he thinks is the future now. And as we go along, what is it that we should look for? So without much ado, I would like to again thank Anupam for spending the time and coming here to share with us his journey, his thoughts on entrepreneurship. And I'm going to hand it over to Sandeep to take this forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and just before starting, we would like to present a small memento to Anupam. May I request Dr. Kanodia to please hand over a small memento to him.
Thank you.
Shall we?
The way we are sitting and so on, we're going to have an informal discussion, and I'll ask Anupam some questions, and then when I'm done, the floor is all yours. You can ask whatever questions you want, and Anupam has said that he's going to be gracious enough to answer any question that you ask. So Anupam, let me start with, we have a lot of young people in the audience here. You are still quite young, but you were at their stage at one point in time. When did you decide that you wanted to be an entrepreneur? Obviously, Paula mentioned you came from a business family, so there is that entrepreneurial spirit that was inside you. But when did you say, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to be a founder, I want to build something?
Yeah, look, I think when I grew up in the 80s, it was a very different time. And today we have access to the internet, we have access to the World Wide Web and all the information at our fingertips. So it's very easy to be proactive and do research on things like what are my career options. Back then, your career option was pretty much what your father did, right? That was your career. If your father was a businessman, you tended to think of yourself as a businessman. And so my dad was a businessman, and he had built his company on his own, and my entire childhood was spent listening to him argue and debate and fight with his vendors. I don't want to use the choicest words he used at that time, but it was fun. It was interesting to see him running this business that he had built. And for me, it wasn't really about whether this was a good alternative. It was the only alternative in some ways. I never really stopped to think whether I could be an engineer or a doctor or an astronaut for that matter. It was sort of preordained. And so I started dabbling in various different activities right from the time I was very young. When I was a teenager, I started a little sports club in my building, which didn't do very well. Then I started an exports business when I was about 20 years old, sending garment-like structures to the US. I managed to get a contract from Germany to send them several millions of these bags, and that really didn't do very well, and I lost a lot of money. My father was kind enough to finance it. And as a young, brash individual would do at the time, I blamed the environment. I said, something's wrong with India, something's wrong with this country, something's wrong with the environment, and that's why I didn't do too well. And so I started thinking about moving to the West, learning from the West, seeing if there was something that I could find there to do. And so I traveled to the US, realized that the only way to stay in the US at that point would be to get a further education, and I wanted to be as far away from this country as I could at that particular time. And so I pursued further education there. Right after that, I decided to join a company and earn some work experience. Again, this was all accidental. It wasn't really a big plan that I was pursuing. I was lucky enough to get a job in what was emerging as the consumer internet space in the US at that point. This was the late 90s now, right? And some of you were probably not even born. How many of you were not even born in the
95.
in the late 90s?
95, 96. 95, most
There you go.
around
Wow.
95 is here.
Now I feel really, really old. But this was the late 90s, and the dot-com boom, if you've read about it, if you weren't born, that's fine, but if you've read about it, it was one of the biggest boom and bust cycles that we've seen in recent history. And we were right there, not just contributing or participating in it, but making it happen. I was part of a company called MicroStrategy. Me and a bunch of guys started something called strategy.com, which went on to become one of the poster children of the dot-com boom. We went from I'd say about $100 million market cap company to about $40 billion in 2 years, right? And all of us had pretty much become multi-millionaires overnight because of our stock options. And so I'm here, a kid from the US. Until a couple of years back, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I'm suddenly sitting on millions of dollars of stock, mind you, not cash. I should have cashed it out, but such is hindsight. And we were booking Ferraris and Porsches and so on and so forth. We knew very little about the ways of the world. And as luck would have it, our company announced an accounting irregularity in March 2000. March 12, 2000, I even remember the date, because that day the NASDAQ fell by about 1,100 points from 5,500. Our stock went from 666 to maybe 300. And by December of that year, the world had come to an end. Our $40 billion market cap company had come back to $60 million. Not only had we lost the millions of dollars each one of us was worth, we were all in debt. So that Ferrari never came. And that was the time that we all started to think about what to do next, and there was a lot of soul searching going on in the US at that point. I was lucky that I had started a small little site on the site in India. And so in the early 2000s, I decided to come back to India and see how the internet opportunity would unfold here, and that's when I started Shaadi.com.
So why call it the People Group? What was the thinking behind the name?
That's a very interesting and actually seems like a very light question, but it's actually a very deep question for me personally. To me, nomenclature represents a very deep insight into how people think. And yes, you could say what's in a name arose by any other name and so on. But to me, it really represents your philosophy in many ways. Once I came back and started Shaadi.com, we were very clear from the beginning that consumer internet is what excited me. And as Paula mentioned, in 2001, there were about 6 or 7 million internet users in India. Do you want to take a guess as to how many there were in 2008? What happened to those 6-7 million people in 2001? Where did it go to in 2008? Any idea?
Guesses? How many? 14 to 15 million.
So close enough. It was about 12 million,
Yeah.
wasn't it? 11 to 12 million. So in 8 years, it went up by 5 million, right? Do you know how many internet users we add every month in this country now? It's pretty close to that number. It's about that number. And that took about 5 to 8 years, right? And every year we used to sit around and think about, next year, this thing is just going to take off. And we're going to have 100 million internet users. And every year we used to sit and think about these things, and it never really came true. And so I started thinking about what else is it that we can do, because it's impossible to scale one business. So you had to be in multiple areas if you were going to have scale. And so we started Moj Mobile, which is a gaming company, started Makan.com. And so we needed a name that kind of unified all this. And thought about many different names, and this tech and that soft and so on and so forth. But ultimately the realization was the most critical competitive advantage in this industry, in this era, or the most sustainable competitive advantage that a company has, is ultimately its people, right? That's what it comes down to. It's not about capital, it's really about people. And so it was really as simple as that, but it took 3 years to come to that name. The simple things are the most obvious sometimes.
And why did you choose wedding and sort of matrimony as your first starting point, as when you came back? Was it in your circle everybody wanted to get married? Did you see a gap somewhere? What was the thinking which said, okay, this is the space where I see an opportunity? What was was it a well thought through thing, or as you said, there's some things you just sort of fall into? What was the process?
Yeah, back in those days, we didn't really think that much. We just kind of did it and went with your gut and intuition. There was no spreadsheet analysis or a lot of market analysis, or at least for me, it wasn't. This was a similar accidental story. I had just come back. No, I had been coming back from the US every year for a month or two. And during one such visit, I was sitting with my dad's office, and this gentleman kind of rolled around, who was, middle-aged, oldish fellow with a suitcase in his hand or briefcase in his hand. And he said he was my dad's friend. He kind of looked suspicious to me, but I humored him. I said, okay, if you're my dad's friend, I can only be so rude. And so I started getting involved in this discussion with him, and pretty soon it became obvious what kind of friend he was, right? So he was one of those typical pundits who knew my family. He knew that acha bhi ladka US return aaya hai, so maybe there's some money for me to be made, and he wanted to get me hitched to one of the families that he knew. And so pretty soon he let go of the pretense and put his briefcase out on the desk and started going through these biodatas of girls with their backgrounds and resumes, and there were maybe 50 or 70 biodatas in there. And I was very amused. At first I was upset, but then I was very, very amused that the choice of my life partner depended on how much weight this man could carry in his briefcase, right? So it got me thinking that if we could take away the spatial limitations from this poor man and put all this on the internet, then my choice would expand multifold. And if this perfect life partner for me was sitting 10,000 miles away, I didn't have to worry about how far this man could travel. So that was really the genesis of the idea. So instead of entertaining him further in terms of the direction he was going in, I asked him if he would be willing to give us those biodatas that we would then put up on the internet. He looked at me like I was crazy, and that is kind of expected when you ask a question like that to somebody. He retreated hastily, but then the idea was born, and we sort of went ahead and made that happen in a couple of years.
That's interesting. You mentioned that he retreated, when you suggested this to him. So when you got going, and obviously this was a very different way. Women did not put themselves out on the internet saying, "Hey, I'm available to get married." So there was a behavioral change that you had to sort of make happen. So what was the approach you took? What sort of allowed you to make the society change and agree to the new way of getting married?
So I think, a lot of times we tend to give ourselves more credit than we deserve for making change. And at that point, as a young, brash individual, I felt that I was also making or driving that change, and we felt that we were making it happen. But if you think about it retroactively, it's a confluence of things that tend to deliver change more than any one individual, whether it's technologies or social changes. The timing has to be right. And I think in the early 2000s, the timing for something like that was right. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. India was rapidly becoming a liberalized nation, right? 90s is when the process started. And by 2000s, we all had cable television, which means we were now exposed to global trends. Before that, we weren't quite as much. People were moving from a mentality of scarcity to a mentality of abundance. And so everybody had aspirations. Everybody wanted to break away from the shackles of a planned economy and find their own path, be opportunistic. And in some way that meant exercising that choice even when your life partner is concerned. No longer was it going to be okay for you to simply, not even see the girl or the guy in several decades back during my parents' time. You actually wanted to engage with that person. Dating was something that was still frowned upon, and even today I think it is. I don't know, I'm too old for that. Is dating okay these days, guys? No?
Yeah,
Not
yes.
yet?
Lot of yeses.
Can you take your boyfriend home and introduce him to your parents? You don't have a boyfriend? You see, the point is that it's not as simple an answer in India. And so there was a solution required which would bridge the transition from, let's say, an arranged situation to a love marriage. And that's what we call Shaadi.com, which is planned marriage. So it's not a chemical reaction like it is in the West, where it is a question of when you have that chemical reaction, fall in love and get married. It is a question of, or rather if, is how it is in the West. If you fall in love, you get married. It is a question of when. In India, marriage is a life stage, and when you hit that life stage, whether you like it or not, your family is getting you married. Right? So we were trying to bridge that transition, and that's kind of what led to.
So after a few of these successful ventures, Moj did extremely well as well, and we'll talk about that in a bit. What would you tell the group here in terms of what worked from a entrepreneurial standpoint, and what would you have done differently? In hindsight, what would you have done differently?
I think you could, if I had to reflect back on what worked, I could put it down to many, many, many different things. Because at different times, different things worked. You needed a different set of attributes or a different type of strength. But if you had to boil it down to one attribute, in my personal opinion, that is essential for success as an entrepreneur, particularly in India, I think it's perseverance. A lot of people talk about timing being very, very important, and yes, timing is very important. But if you persevere, eventually you get the timing right. Right? Let's take one of the most famous stories of entrepreneurship, which is Steve Jobs. Right? And for all his life, he was almost considered a failure, although he went out of Apple and did wonderful things and built other companies, but because he could do nothing with Apple, he was considered a failure. But because he persevered, he came back, eventually he got the timing right. And when digitization happened and when the chip started to become a reality in the form it is today, he was able to create the most valuable company in the world. So I think perseverance, above all else, is probably the single most important ingredient. Just stay the course, and the world spins around on its axis, so if you stay in one place, it'll come back to you. Right?
So perseverance requires, either being profitable or having enough money in the bank. How did you sort of drive that? Was it? I know you raised some money in between. I don't know if it was in the company or it was secondary, but what was the thinking in terms of I'm going to build a sustainable business that allows me to persevere as the environment around me is changing?
So I think, Sandeep, it's kind of hard, at least when you're building a company, in my view, to really, you can have a very long-term view or a vision of where you want to be, but I don't think you can have a long-term plan of how you get there, right? Every 2 or 3 years, you have to reinvent, you have to rethink, you have to recalibrate, because the environment around you starts to shift, the floor beneath you starts to change. And so our planning cycles are typically 2 to 3 years. When we started, frankly, if you asked me what VC stood for, I would probably say vice chancellor or something, right? I didn't know it meant venture capitalist. An angel was something you became when you died, right? Not somebody who gave you money. So our definitions of these terms itself were so different that we didn't have this concept of raising capital and then building your business. It is only in 2007 that we started to understand what venture capital is, or 2006, I should say, when the first or the second wave of venture capitalists came into India. So our businesses were profitable for long. In fact, when we raised venture capital money is when we started making losses. So yeah, you have to be careful. It's a double-edged sword. But then, of course, we realized that this was not a business to be losing too much money in, and we turned profitable again. So really, our planning cycle, even now, is more about 2 to 3 years. If you see a large enough opportunity which has very high competitive intensity, then you probably need a big round of capital to see you through that period. But if you don't have high competitive intensity, of the industry is characterized by very, very strong unit economics, then you probably don't need a lot of capital in the interim. So I think that's kind of how we look at it.
So that's interesting. You said 2 to 3 years. Do you think in the current environment, with the way you're seeing change happen, and I know you're working with a lot of companies where you've invested, is it still 2 to 3 years, or you think that planning cycle has shrunk even further?
You could make that argument that you need to sort of compress it even further, but I'm thinking about this as you ask me that question, Sandeep, and I struggle to see how you can compress a business planning cycle to less than 2 to 3 years. Because, by the time you invest in any particular direction, it's already 2 to 3 months. It takes at least 2 to 3 quarters to start seeing how that's playing out. So unless you're a really, really small company that's figuring out what to do, and then the cycles might be 2 quarters, because you're still trying to find out which business opportunity or which business model you should stay with. If you've already got a business model and you're growing in a certain direction, I think less than 2 to 3 years would be very, very hard.
I think that's a fair point, that depending on how big you are, if you have established business,
yeah,
then you can't pivot it in a 6 month or 1 year or 2
absolutely.
years.
But if you're very small, then
Yeah,
I
then
think
you
you
can-
could have a...
That's fair. So at what point did you say, hey, listen, I have a bunch of businesses that I'm running, but I'm seeing all these guys running around, building other businesses, and I want to be part of that, and I want to be an angel, and I want to invest in them. At what stage in your journey did you say, hey, I want to take part in these other opportunities?
So, as an entrepreneur, I would say the definition of entrepreneur is an opportunist, right? Wouldn't it? You could make that argument that you could define an entrepreneur as being an opportunist. An opportunist is somebody who is almost like a compulsive gambler. He sees an opening and he wants to take it, right? And true with me as well. So in 2007, when this economy started to open up and we had venture capitalists coming again and young individuals were starting to create companies, There was one such company that we used to work with at Shadi.com called Interactive Avenue. Well, it was not called Interactive Avenues, I beg your pardon. There was a group of people working at a company called MediaTurf that was India's first digital agency. Now, my background was I had just come from the US. I had seen digital agencies. There had been a wave of merger and acquisition in the digital agency landscape prior to 2007 at valuations that exceeded 100 million. Microsoft had bought one. AOL had bought one. Several companies were buying digital ad agencies. And it seemed very obvious. Sometimes when you're naive and foolish, things appear a lot more obvious than when you become cynical. And sometimes when you act upon them, and if luck's on your side, and when you're young, luck is definitely on your side, you tend to make the right decisions. So I came across these bunch of guys at MediaTurf, and they were kind of wanting to get out and start a company on their own. And because we enjoyed using their services, I liked the team, I had seen the background of what was happening with digital ad agencies, I wrote them a check in my foolishness. And that actually became one of India's largest ad agencies, which we exited in 2012, in the largest transaction in that space. And that's kind of how I started angel investing. In 2011, a young boy came to me saying, you know, getting a taxi was hard in India, and that I should put some money into his company so he could make it easy to get taxis. And you know, living in Bombay, you guys are all from Bombay, I'm assuming. For me, it was never hard to get a taxi. Right? You just walk down, cross the street, and there's a taxi. So I was like, really? I mean, it's not that hard getting a taxi. But this guy persisted, and during that time I went to Delhi. I happened to, as luck would have it again, I went for a trip to Delhi. And in Delhi, it's really hard to get a taxi, by the way. Right? And it hit me when I came back, because I had already told him, no, this doesn't make sense. I came back and I said, wait a second, maybe the guy's onto something. So over the next 1 month, I started calling his call center every week. He had a call center, that's how he used to send you a taxi. And every time I called his call center, he used to answer the phone himself and patiently walk me through the process of ordering a cab. And I used to deliberately be very irritable to see how he reacted. So I'd give him the choicest of abuses, but he was still very, very patient. And it kind of reminded me of when I had started. And while I didn't believe in the idea, I thought this gentleman deserved a shot at building a company. And that company today is called Ola, and that founder is obviously Bhavish. So the first couple of times it was sort of accidental and opportunistic, and then by 2012, it had dawned on me that, look, there's going to be a wave of entrepreneurship, and this is the time to get in and bet on other sort of entrepreneurs.
So you mentioned that there were certain characteristics about Bhavish that sort of said, okay, let's give him a chance. What are the general characteristics that you look for in an entrepreneur that you are backing today?
So again, to formalize something that you've learned over all these years into one sentence is always hard.
Guys, listen carefully, because if you come and ask him for money, these are the things that you want to have.
So yeah, I mean, it's hard to put it very succinctly, but if I had to boil it down to a couple of things, I think one of the most important things for me is the reason the entrepreneur is doing what he's trying to do. Not because the spelling of entrepreneurship has suddenly changed to S-E-X-Y, right? Just because it's sexy doesn't mean you do it. To me, there has to be a deeper reason. If the entrepreneur is deeply passionate about something and he sees himself doing it for the next 20 years, that's a green light for me, right? I mean, that's only the first filter, but that's a very, very important reason as to why this person is doing what he's doing. Of course, intellect and all that come, but those are just filters, right? Everybody goes, you go through that. The second, of course, is perseverance, which I pointed out. Any attributes in the entrepreneur that demonstrate that they will persevere when the odds are tough, because it takes time to build a company. It's hard, it's laborious, particularly in India. Everything takes 5 times as much time and 3x as much capital in India as it does in the West. So I think these are a couple of things that I'm very particular about. And then, of course, comes into play the market opportunity that you're going after. Does it have the potential to create disproportionate returns for an investor? Right? So even if the market opportunity was nice, and you'd build some value, but it wouldn't really return me any disproportionate value, it's probably not the best angel investment. You might do it for other reasons, but not for making money.
That's a good segue to say, okay, we've talked about things that have worked. So what hasn't worked? There must be some investment that you've made. You said, what was I thinking when I did this? Without naming, maybe I don't know if you want to name the company or not, but any places where things haven't worked?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few. I think out of the 100 odd companies that I've invested in, 20 have already been written off. I'll probably write off another 40 before I'm done. But that's the name of the game, as you know, Sandeep. But I think there's a few red flags for sure. One is the wrong reasons to be building a company, as I pointed out. That's a clear red flag. 2 is lack of focus, so wanting to do too many things too soon. So I personally prefer one product businesses. Whenever there's somebody who's come with 2 or 3 different services and 2 or 3 different products, I generally will not invest. That's another filter for me. I think these are a couple of the things, and what's kind of not worked, I'm thinking as we speak, I think one of the key things that we've seen that's worked, so the opposite has not worked, is the lack of learning agility. So, or the lack of taking input and learning from that input and growing from that input. So, I spoke about persevering, and there's a line between persevering and being obstinate and stubborn, right? Even when things are not working for you, you take a very, very hard position, dig your heels in, and continue to do what you can obviously see is not working. And usually those happen because of reasons such as ego, emotion, and so on and so forth. And every time things have not worked, in my view, not every time, most times things have not worked, it's been because of the emotional issues or the ego issues that have come in the way. And I think finally, particularly in India, what doesn't work, especially if you're building a tech company, is not having a tech co-founder. It can work in the West, but in India, it most definitely does not work. So that's a big red flag for us.
So I think that's again, maybe a way to think. A question that comes around that is, you've done a bunch of companies that are consumer focused, right? So, and I know that as we were discussing earlier, that in India, not all consumers pay. For example, you were lucky you found a market with Shadi where people were willing to pay pandits and they were willing to pay you. But if you look at what's happening in e-commerce right now, people are still losing money.
Yep.
Because it's discounts that getting people to buy. And so some people say, hey, the new wave of investing is B2B. Back companies that are selling to other businesses because they pay. What's your view? Is it B2C? Is it B2B? Where is the opportunity in India right now?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So if you have to start peeling the layers, ultimately to me, if you look at it from a global level, all money comes from consumers. So even B2B businesses ultimately are financed by consumers. So if you simply take a view that consumer businesses don't create value, that would be highly flawed. If you look at Alibaba, you look at Amazon, you look at Apple, these are the most valued companies in the world, and these are all direct-to-consumer companies. But if we look at closer home in India, yes, there is a question of affordability. And let's try to peel that onion as well. We are a $2 trillion economy, you're close there, I could be off. 500, 600 billion is driven by consumption. But the challenge is that our per capita is very low. So most of that 500, 600 billion is essentially spent on non-discretionary items. So healthcare, education, food items, housing. Once you go past all these, there's very little left in terms of discretionary spend. So it's only about 50, 60 million at the top of the funnel, or the top of the peak, that have very high discretionary income, right? And those are the people that you see today on e-commerce. And if you look at all the e-commerce companies, their biggest challenge today is to increase the number of people transacting, and so they're probably now going to focus, or they're already focusing on increasing the number of transactions per user. Having said that, so I think so there is a challenge in the consumer space. Let's sort of establish that in terms of people's ability to pay in India. Having said that, I think that has changed quite a bit in the last few years, and that is changing very rapidly as we speak. Today, young people have, yes, employment, sir, is a big challenge, and it's one of my pet peeves, but it's much better in some ways than it used to be. So today, an average young guy can go get a job at a retail store, which we could never find jobs when we were growing up. So 4 people living in a household in India today, 2, 3 could be having a job, and that starts to create discretionary income. I think we're still at the early cycle of that, but it's changing as we speak. So the places to kind of invest in, I would say, or where the opportunities lie, is clearly the non-discretionary areas like healthcare and education, which still need a lot of reinvention in India. And then into niche spaces, into consumption areas, whether it is FMCG, as we are seeing, technology-led, if it is, even better, or niche areas like we did with Shaadi.com, which over time, I think as the economy starts to grow, per capita starts to grow, discretionary income starts to grow, will become very, very, very interesting. So kind of a mixed bag of an answer, but.
So, but it's, education, healthcare is all sort of, as you said, is consumption-led. So
Consumption-led, yeah.
So basically, you're saying consumption is the focus.
Education, healthcare, transportation, these are where all the non-discretionary spends go.
Yeah.
And we know there are challenges in all these areas. So if you look at 2, 3 of my companies, they are in the transportation space. So Ola, there's another company called DriveZ you might have read about recently that's doing some very, very interesting space stuff. There's a company called Rapido, which is motorcycle transport, or motorcycle taxis, if you will. So I've got 5 companies in the transportation space, and 3 of them are doing exceedingly well, because these are the fundamental problems in this country which these companies are addressing.
If you if you were to tell the people over here that this is the next check I'm writing, who would you write that check to? Which
Anybody who makes me money. No, I think, look, I would use that same lens, right? I mean, so Sandeep, with a VC and with an angel investor, it's very different sometimes, right? He has to answer to his limited partners. I don't have anybody to answer to except my wife, who's sitting right here. So I can take a little more liberty than Sandeep can, although it's not always easy if you knew my wife. But I do. But the point here is this, right? I don't have to look for a 50x return every time. I can make investments in areas that I'm really excited and passionate about, even though it may not make me that much money, just because I'm enjoying it. So sometimes I write checks in those directions. For example, I made an investment in a restaurant. I'm never going to make real money out of it, but I did it because I thought it was interesting and exciting. So I will do some of that. But if I was to look at it purely from a return standpoint, and the more institutional hat is the areas that I would invest in, I think consumption is what excites me. I think India is very early as far as consumption is concerned. I think India is very early as far as brands are concerned. Over the next 10 years, my view, my personal view, is that this country will create thousands of brands. We are completely brand starved. If you ask an average person about the number of brands of clothing and so on, you'll name 3, 4, 5, 7, 10. When you go to the West, everything is a brand. And you will see that India will move very rapidly from an informal to a formal, from an unbranded to a branded economy over the next few years. And in the bargain, there'll be entrepreneurs who will create disproportionate value because brand ultimately does give you disproportionate value. So that's an area that I'm looking at. If it's tech-led, even better.
No, I think you're right. One of the things that I'm hearing when I talk to friends who are, building or who are running large companies with both demonetization and GST coming in, they're saying that one of the big things that's happening from that is the informal economy is getting squeezed, and more sort of stuff is moving towards the formal economy, which sort of fits into your branding.
Yeah, so the government is also catalyzing some of this now, finally.
Yeah, absolutely right. So, switching gears, because you mentioned that your major LP is sitting in the corner over there. How do you look at work-life balance, right? You have, you're expecting, you mentioned, you're starting a family and all that stuff, and we talked about, life will not change too much, but, as we said, life does change quite a bit. So how do you think about that as an entrepreneur? What was the work-life balance when you're working with, 70, 100, angel investments? I'm sure you're spending time with the entrepreneurs and guiding them and so on. So that takes a lot of time. I have 10 portfolio companies, you have 100. How do you manage that? How do you look at work-life balance?
So simple formula, right, for work-life balance is you work hard and your wife lives well. That's basically work-life balance. But jokes apart, I have never quite understood it, Sandeep. I've tried very hard over the years. I've read a lot about how if you only work and don't play, you'll burn out. I've never quite understood it. I cannot compartmentalize and say I will spend 8 hours on this and then I'll spend 2 hours on this, and once I finish my day in the office, I'll completely shut out. I don't think it works in our industries. As an entrepreneur, especially as a tech entrepreneur, I don't think it works. And anybody who tells you otherwise is kidding, right? So I think the only way and by work-life balance, I think what we are trying to actually get to is we're not saying you want work-life balance for the sake of work-life balance. Work-life balance seems to indicate a means to an end, which is a more fulfilling life, right? So the work-life balance is a means to a more fulfilling life. And if you're going to be a startup tech entrepreneur, you have to find fulfillment and meaning in the work that you're doing. And if you do that, then really there's no concept of work-life balance.
So, that sort of brings me to the next question, that you really can't switch off, as you mentioned, right? And one of the things that in our current economy and, you're investing regularly and so on is, how do you stay current, right? The world is changing around you, there are new ideas that are coming up. Somebody comes to you and says, Anupam, this is the next thing I want to build. How do you know that there are not 100 other people doing it? Will it succeed, not succeed, all of that stuff, right? Which requires you to be somewhat current with what's happening around. What do you do to sort of stay on top of what's happening?
Oh, I think one is I try to spend a lot of time with VCs like yourself. You guys seem to have all the information.
Wrong place to spend time.
All the information and the data.
We come to you.
No, I think, look, I think there's only 2-3 ways you can do this, right? If you try to learn and understand everything that's going on, you're most certainly going to fail, because there's just such an explosion of information that you can't stay on top of it. I think there's only 2 or 3 principles that you can imbibe that can maybe help you stay current. One, of course, is that you read a lot, but be careful about what you read. Facebook is not the place to get your news, for example. So be careful about what you consume, right? What you eat and what you drink and what you think and what you read is what makes you. So that's a very, very critical attribute. I shut out everything that creates noise, right? If I put on a Hindi news channel, and don't watch Hindi news channels in this country, seriously, that's just noise, it's not news. I shut it off immediately because it creates noise. So I think being on top of the right information, not information, but the right information is very important. The second, I think, is engaging with young people, right? Because as you get older, and you don't have that problem just yet, but you will someday. As you get older, you tend to look at life very differently than when you're a lot younger. And it's very, very important to stay connected to the youth. I managed to do that through my investing activities and look at life from their lens. Look at the apps that they have on their phone. Look at their behaviors and how they think. And that's changing so dramatically that you start to imbibe some of that if you spend enough time with that, right? There's a lot of studies been done on how human beings ultimately are influenced by brain waves, and you are the person you hang out with, right? So I think that's one thing that I try to do in terms of staying on top of things. And I think there was sort of one more thing, but it sort of escapes me now. But if it comes back to me, I'll let you know.
That's great. I think you're absolutely right. That
Oh yeah, the last one, I think probably the most important, is probably the first principles. Is a first principle, is you have to be the user, right? So you have to develop this intuition, this gut, by being the user, not by observing and saying, अच्छा ये करेंगे तो उसको पसंद आ जाएगा, ये करेंगे तो वो खरीद लेंगे. It doesn't work like that. If you don't buy into it, just because it sounds cool, doesn't mean that it's going to work. For example, I hear this all the time. I want to ask you here today, right? How many of you want your refrigerator to talk to your toaster? Why would you want your refrigerator to talk to your toaster? Right? But every time I hear an entrepreneur or a business plan, or when I hear of IoT, which is Internet of Things, they give the same example.
connected home.
That your refrigerator will be able to talk to your toaster. I say, look, that's wonderful. And, IoT could be wonderful if you could tell me if my baby was not sleeping very well at night, but why are you telling me about my refrigerator and my toaster, right? So if it makes no sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense. So go with first principles. I think that's the other important thing.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that. One of the things that I do whenever anybody comes to me with app and says, hey, could be gaming, could be, any app, the first thing I do is I download it on my, and I'm not the best user. And if I cannot use it, I would say, I give it to my son. If, he gives me feedback, and if he doesn't use it, then I said, no point, because you've covered the two ends of the spectrum. And so having first-hand experience is very, very critical in sort of you do. I think what I'll do now is, I'm sure there are a lot of people here that have questions in the audience. I would like Dr. Kanodia to sort of start this. You were one of the original entrepreneurs. I think you came back in the 60s to start Datamatics. Based on what you heard, any questions to Anupam? And he's obviously come at a very different time. Any thoughts or sort of questions for Anupam?
Obviously, the whole thing is right up there, and I think it will. When do you think this scenario of eyeballs, as we call it, will taper off in India, and we'll see some real money coming out of these ventures in India? What's your estimate?
So, if I could reframe the question, when will these become real businesses? Is that sort of
In the classic sense of the word.
in the classic sense? So when will we see cash flows, and when will we sort of move away from burning so much money and raising so much capital? I think it's a very, very important question. I think we're all sort of grappling with that as VCs and investors and entrepreneurs. But I think there's a couple of points I want to make there. I think often we take very extreme positions on that continuum. It's either, let's burn a lot of money, or this makes no sense because you're burning a lot of money. I think the truth lies somewhere in between, and let me explain why. Some companies, some industries rather, I should say, lend themselves to monopolization because of network effects. And the nature of certain products are such that once you start using them, you cannot go back. How many of you here use Ola or Uber? Show of hands? 80-90%. Digital wallets, chat messenger, Can you imagine life without these now? Now, the point here is, in few short years, you have latched onto products that you cannot imagine life without. The other side of the equation on the business side, sir, is that all these businesses lend themselves to monopolization because of the strong network effects. The more users you get, the more users want to come in. The more users who come in, that's sort of the more users you get. And they create very, very strong network effects. To such an extent that it becomes impossible for other entrants to come in. So whenever there is monopolization in large market opportunities, in large industries, the value that's going to be created is disproportionate. Uber is worth today $80 billion, or 65 you could argue. You could say it's not worth 65, it's worth $40 billion. But the point is this, Uber does $3.5–4 billion of net revenue, not billing, net revenue. A technology company like Uber, you can very well project out what their expenses would be on a fully scaled out model. You can very well see how they get to $8–10 billion of free cash flow a year in a matter of the next few years. So that's really what's driving the valuation and the funding for many of these companies. Of course, greed gets the better of us, and the real value lies in selection. But everybody thinks they're selecting the right company, and hence there's more and more company or money backing many of these companies. I think it is justified in certain areas, particularly if your money is behind the guy who's going to end up winning, right? But there are a lot of other areas, I think, as a result, that have been dragged along this continuum, assuming that they will also be a winner-takes-all model, and they will also represent high network effects. And that, unfortunately, has not played out or will not play out. And a lot of people will be left with their fingers burnt. Logistics is one such area, for example. I personally think a lot of money has gone into a lot of companies, and I don't think it's a winner-take-all model. So we'll see what happens, but some industries don't justify the funding that's going in. Having said that, I am privy to some companies that are doing really well and that have raised a lot of capital. I can say, based on the data that I have, that at least 2 of them are very rapidly moving towards profitability. And you should, and recent funding rounds in the last 3 months, we've seen Flipkart raise a lot of money. We've seen Ola, you must have seen, just $2 billion announced yesterday. We've seen Big Basket, again, closing a large round. At a time where people were really sitting on the fence and saying, look, is this really going to work? So there is a lot of validation that's come in the last few months, and it's because some of these metrics are trending very, very well.
I think, Anupam, just you mentioned something earlier when we were discussing this notion of will the consumer pay or not. And I think what you're highlighting is the fact that as consumers get more and more hooked onto convenience, they sort of start giving up on the discount and the pricing issue and start focusing more on convenience. And what I'm hearing you say is that, in effect, you're seeing the Indian consumer move towards convenience as the primary driver for usage rather than price.
Yeah, that's a great, I think it's only the beginning.
Yeah.
We still value deals more than time, and you only value convenience when you start valuing time.
Yeah.
So right now there's still not a big premium on time, but I think it's starting to happen.
Are you also seeing, sorry, I'll come back to the audience again, but are you also seeing, so the big shift that happened in the US was advertising really took off on the internet, right? So you saw a lot of, so you look at Google and Facebook, I would say both of them have reached where they have because of the so that's one thing in India that we still haven't seen. We haven't seen advertising move from TV and print to the digital side as much as we had expected. So this is your proverbial, it'll happen this year, it'll happen this year. Do you see that shifting?
Well, I think it is shifting, but this is going to open a whole can of worms. But let me just humor me for a minute, if you will, because I'm going to go off on a bit of a diatribe here. But it is happening, Sandeep. I think India's advertising market, by the way, any guesses? You guys are students, business guys, entrepreneurs. What do you think? How big is India's advertising market? No idea.
Any idea?
Okay, it's about. I was just trying to wake you up. So it's about $6 billion.
Yeah, 8 billion.
Okay,
Yeah,
six to $8 billion. The U.S. Any guesses? How big is the size of the advertising industry in the U.S.? Take a guess.
So the economy is about 10 times in size, right? So
50 to 60.
how
So-
much?
60? No, it's actually about $300 billion.
Much larger. As a percentage of the economy, it's much larger.
It's $300 billion. So even if you manage to get a wedge in there and you start a content site called, nameyourdog.com, and you get 2 million users, you can start to generate some meaningful advertising revenue. In India, guess how much of that 1 billion, sorry, 6 billion is the advertising pie, 1 billion is digital advertising. Guess how much of that is taken by Facebook and Google? Just two companies. 80%.
Yeah.
Not just that, 90% of all incremental advertising dollars goes to Facebook and Google, right? Because advertising is always a game of whoever captures the most attention, right? It's all about scale. And the reason, this is one of my big issues, and I wish Mr. Kanodia had still been here, but the reason is because I think we as a country and as a government have not had the foresight, and I know you're not going to like this, but let me put it out there, to protect our industries. Digital has been seen as something niche, somebody's hobby, and while we've protected every other industry, like insurance, banking, airlines, we've pretty much handed over our future to the monopolies that are coming from the West. Now, protectionism sounds like a very strong word, and I don't buy into that as well. But I think we need a level playing field because digital companies lend themselves to monopolization, and once network effects come in, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to compete with them. And that's why Facebook and Google take away 90% of all incremental advertising revenue. We have pretty much mortgaged our future because digital is not an industry anymore. It is everything, right? And so I am a strong proponent of not allowing FDI in digital, or at least limiting it. FII, of course, should be encouraged and welcome, and the difference is FDI is when foreign companies own our digital companies. FII is when foreign institutional investors invest in our companies. Investment should be welcome, but owning Indian digital companies should not. And the reasons I outlined is because we are mortgaging our entire future. And the more important part is, if we had not protected, people hate that word, so I'll shy away from that. But if we had given our local companies a level playing field, I think in the next few years, we would have created 50 multi-billionaires, first generation digital entrepreneurs, who would have inspired an entire nation to build disproportionate value in the coming years. I think the job of this government would have been done, right? Simply by inspiring the entire country. I think we've lost that opportunity, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I generally agree with you that we did need a level playing field. We've also been on the other side where we've seen the impact of the non-level playing field, in e-commerce and other areas. So,
I mean, look at China, right?
Yeah.
I mean, today when Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, they are competing with America's best. And the only reason they could do that is because these Western companies were not allowed to come into China until the digital economies were up to a certain level.
Any other questions? Yeah, I'll come to you next.
Well, startups are assumed to be from the certain segment of the age. As a venture capitalist, do you have some, band in mind that beyond this age you would not consider?
This was a question that was there. I didn't ask him.
No, look, I mean, I'll answer that question. You want the honest answer or you want the political answer? The honest answer? Okay, let me, here it is, right? Entrepreneurship in India is a very, very long-term game. Our markets are not deep enough like in the West where you can flip companies in 2 years for hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're not very acquisitive as yet. We don't have the catalyst companies which do a lot of acquisitions every year. So what that leads to is typically you see value creation in 10 to 20 year cycles, which means you need entrepreneurs who have the energy to bat at a certain velocity for 10 years, 15 years at a stretch. To achieve that, you need biology on your side, right? You need nature on your side. And if you start in your late 20s, and that's what I think is the right age, you've got a good shot at delivering value while you still have a lot of energy. If you start in your 40s, it becomes harder and harder. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible, and there's exceptions to every rule, but if you had to ask me to generalize, which is what I'm doing, then I would generalize that it's better to start in your late 20s than in your 40s. That's sort of the broad rule of thumb that I look at.
One more question. What about supporting this social enterprise?
I don't do that.
Any reasons?
It is a question of philosophy. My view, at least until now, and that might change in the future, is entrepreneurship itself is the biggest social service that you can do. I think if we back the right entrepreneurs, we will create jobs. If we create jobs, we will spread wealth. If we spread wealth, it will reduce inequality. And there's no better social service than that. I think the current social service structures, which is to give money to charity, I think social entrepreneurship is welcome, and I think there's enough funds out there that are doing a great job. I personally don't have any expertise in that area, so that's why I stay away from it. But when it comes to charitable type of endeavors, I don't have a framework for governance, monitoring.
Not for charity, but to promote social enterprise, which is linked with the business or the entrepreneurship. And some youngsters, if they have some good ideas, there are some examples which have surfaced during last 5 years in particular. I came to know about one, social entrepreneur. He's a PhD from IIT, Bombay. He's, giving goats, bakri, in the tribal areas, or that's his model. And by now, about more than 500 families have been supported. So, I mean, that's one example where whether, from the whatever society or especially the have-nots or the marginalized people, and somebody has some idea, okay, which can add a lot of value to that segment. So I just wanted
Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very relevant and good question. So what you're talking about is not for profit, you're talking about social enterprises specifically. Look, I think every person has a certain canvas that they must use to make an impact. For me personally, my canvas is understanding digital entrepreneurship and having looking at tech very closely, and therefore being able to recognize opportunities in that space. I don't personally understand the social impact space as well as many other people do. So it's not a canvas that I'm willing to pick up right now, because there's only so much that one person can do. So I think I've chosen to focus on that deliberately.
And I think Anupam's bringing up a very important point. As entrepreneurs, one of the things is that when you're looking to raise capital, you have to understand what the person you're going to approach, what is their thesis, what are they looking to do. And most angels, or even VCs as investors, we actually publish our portfolio. We tell you what type of companies we've invested in. So if you come to us with I may not do stuff in real estate, and you come to me with a real estate investment, I won't do it, right? So it's a waste of your time and potentially my time. Similarly, if Anupam doesn't have a social set of entrepreneurs in his portfolio, then going to him with a social business plan doesn't really make sense, right? So I think everybody has different theses around which they invest, and as he said, you're writing your personal check, so you want to make sure that you can actually add value. So for that reason, it's very important from both sides, even for the entrepreneur, to approach the right investor at the right time. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So considering the fact that you're from the IT space, I just wanted to know, in terms of business opportunities, do you think the new blockchain technology, which I'm sure you're aware of, will that be the next .com boom in a few years?
So, look, I think the blockchain technology is interesting for what it can do. But the value will come from the applications of it and how you're able to use that technology to create a business that creates value. So it's very hard to make a generalization about blockchain in terms of whether it's going to be the next big thing. It's like saying when the internet came out, is the internet going to be the next big thing? I think most certainly there's going to be a lot of companies that create a lot of value around blockchain. I'm not sure if your question is more layered than that, but if it is, I'm happy to.
No, I mean, in terms of business opportunities, where do you think the application of blockchain would lie?
I'm not enough of an expert on blockchain specifically. From whatever I understand is that it has the ability to take away intermediaries, and so it's very interesting. How exactly it plays out, I'm not fully qualified to answer at this point. But look, the one thing, if you're asking about where I see the next wave of opportunities lying, I can share my views on how I think, if you look at historically how things have changed and where we are today, and where things are going, I can share some views on what I think is digital tech transitioning into. Right? So I think if you look back, what started maybe in the 60s or 70s, which is digitization really, I think we've just about seen the first wave of digitization get complete, which is sort of the digitization of all the infrastructure. So whether it is chips, whether it is sensors in smartphones, whether it is content, whether it is analog signals to digital signals on telecom, I think that entire infrastructure creation is now sort of complete, right? And all the technologies that we are using today, whether it is chat, whether it is website, or whether they are apps, are a manifestation of the interface layer of those technologies. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's all these fundamental technologies under the surface that have manifested into a bunch of interfaces that we are today using that we call apps and so on and so forth. I think these interfaces are very rapidly going to move towards intelligence, right? Today you have to engage with an interface to figure out what it is that you want to do, how you want to do it, when you want to do it, and so on. I think over time you will see these interfaces move, add a layer of intelligence, and that's kind of where I see a lot of action moving. Whether that happens through artificial intelligence, blockchain, Internet of Things, or a combination of all, we will see how it plays out.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Congratulations, Anupam, what you achieved.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just reading a little before I came here, and there's a little part of your journey where you actually started Sagai.com, and then you went on to convert it into Shadi.com. How did that happen? And you actually pioneered into this whole matrimony column, got into Sagai, and then you actually moved it to Shadi.com. Why did you do that? And what was that phase actually when Shadi.com came in from Sagai? Because till today, even if you type in Shadi.com, it goes down to Sagai.com, it goes to Shadi. How did that phase happen? When did you decide to make that switch and build a brand that which you kind of got it afterwards?
Well, yeah, there's actually a very interesting anecdote as far as that is concerned. So I'm glad you asked that question. I was saying earlier that sometimes when you're very young, foolishness and naivety sort of are on your side, right? And I only say it half jokingly because those foolish and naive decisions, when you look back in hindsight, could be some of the best decisions you made. So this was, in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, when I returned from the US, and I'd started something called Sagai.com because that was the domain that's available. In 2000, there was not a whole lot of domains available. Everything was pretty much gone because of the first .com boom. So when I came back and started to really get my mind around what it is that we have in Sagai and how big it could be, it occurred to me that, and I was talking about nomenclature as well earlier. I don't know if you were here, but it occurred to me that, look, if you're going to build something that's well known across the length and breadth of this country, Sagai as a word is not going to cut it. Because if I just break this room up into 5 different groups and ask you to spell that word, you would all spell it differently, right? And if I asked somebody in South India what Sagai meant, they'd never know, right? So if you were going to build a pan-India brand that appealed to everyone, you needed a word, a term that was very easy to spell and that had a certain weight about it. And that's how we came up with the idea of acquiring Shaadi.com. As it happens, I reached out to this gentleman who owned Shaadi.com at the time, and the .com boom was just over, so domains weren't that valuable, but this guy wanted about, I think it was $30,000 for that domain. There wasn't much of a business, it was just a domain. So that's about 20 odd lakh rupees. Now that's all the money that we had in the bank at the point, right? Literally, maybe another couple of $1,000s, but that was really all we had. Again, because I was foolish and naive and brash, I might add, I figured, what the hell, let's just pay it. We tried negotiating with this gentleman, but he wouldn't have any of it. Everybody thought it was an obnoxious amount of money to be paying for a domain after 2000. But because of the brashness, we went ahead, put that money down and bought that domain. And I would attribute a big part of Shaadi.com's success to its name. Even today, we have to spend less than half of what our competitors spend because of the strong brand that we've been able to build. So, sometimes luck does favor the foolish.
While you were building that, you came up with a brilliant strategy of doing online and offline by setting up Shaadi points. And at one point we thought that you would actually have this whole franchise models of Shaadi Point. When did you decide that it's not working and you wanted to actually call it off, or does it still come as a plan that you want to build it up?
I think it's there, it's still there. There's about 50 of them. I think, at one point, because internet penetration wasn't growing the way we wanted it to grow, that same thing of every year expecting it to start jumping from next year, but that elusive sort of dream, we started figuring that, look, we really needed to get out there, create credibility around the brand, because parents are still driving these decisions and they're not getting on the internet. So unless and until they can touch and feel and walk into a place where they can talk to somebody, they're not going to buy into this concept. So that was the idea behind launching it. But India is very, very hard to control distributed workforces, to manage franchisee operations. And we realized that along the way, and so we kind of modified our strategy to really make them very, very focused, as opposed to an indiscriminate rollout across the country. So it's still part of the strategy, but it's extremely focused. So maybe that 50 will go to 60 or 70, but that's kind of where it'll stay.
We'll take a couple more questions and then sort of wrap it up. I guess there's quite a few. Go ahead.
Sir, I had actually 2 questions.
Sure.
One was when I was reading about you, your profile, I'd seen that you had been also into movie productions. That was 99 in 2009. That was in the 29th of May 2009. The movie 99 was your last movie production. And after that, you have not been into much of movie productions. So was there any specific reason for it, or maybe something like, no, as you said, you are attracted towards money. So was that movie production part not attracting much of money, or something else?
You want to be an entrepreneur or an actor?
Yeah, actually, I am an entrepreneur myself.
An entrepreneur, okay.
I am.
No, look, I mean, the movie business has always been interesting to me just because it's creative, you can tell a story, you can impact a lot of people, right? These are the primary 3 reasons that it's been interesting to me. When you're not, when you don't know better, sometimes you make the right decisions, sometimes foolishness makes you make the right decisions, sometimes it makes you make really bad decisions, right? And because it attracted me because of these three reasons, we started to think we could upend the industry as well and create scalability in an industry that really doesn't lend itself to scalability. We figured out the hard way that it's very difficult, if not impossible, particularly in India, to build a scalable model around a film studio. And that's really why we've not done it since.
So my second
Can
question
we
is,
do one question because there are lots of questions that are around the table. We'll come back to you if you have time.
I'll catch you outside, okay?
Yeah.
Hello. First, I would like to say you really made a great point about advertising dollars going out of India. I think I run app development company. I have developed apps for enterprises as well as I work with a lot of startups. First thing I speak to them and I tell them, the day you start having an app idea, start building your network, because it's the biggest challenge is the distribution. So you started off in 2000, like early. So consumer internet business, building it in that time and compare it to this day and age. I feel it is a big challenge that if you are building out an app as a startup, you need funding. Am I right or wrong on this particular notion of myself? Because I do agree, you have a sticky app, it will definitely go viral, but how many of them actually go viral, like Snapchat? Not many, but there are certain applications which are, people are really working on, but not really getting any kind of feedback because of the distribution problem. So if you were to start a Shaadi.com right now, how different would be a strategy in terms of a startup? Like, because I meet a lot of startups and they keep on asking me. As a matter of fact, for myself, I have started making my own media properties where I earn from advertisements. So that's something I really would want you to touch it on.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? How do you build a startup in today's time when distribution is seemingly expensive? To be honest with you, I don't think distribution is expensive. I don't think distribution is a challenge. I think retention is a challenge. I know enough entrepreneurs who get to 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, a million users by spending very, very little money. Today, the cost, you can get one download, if you do it correctly, for as little as 2 to 3 rupees, right? So it's not that expensive to get distribution. The challenge is in retention, right? And if you've cracked retention, you don't need to worry about anything. So it comes back to what I was saying earlier, is simply building an app and hoping they will come is not a sustainable strategy. What is the insight behind which you're building your app? Is there an unmet need that you've discovered which pretty much makes your app like a drug? Like if you take Facebook, you take Snapchat, you give the examples yourself. I don't think these apps really required them to go out and spend a lot of money in driving downloads. In fact, people who spend a lot of money in driving downloads, invariably we see that they don't actually result in successful businesses, right? So you've got to have a very large component of your app distribution strategy, whether that is 40%, 50%, 60% or 70% is arguable, but it needs to be north of 40% in my view, right? So that's where I would spend my energies. How do you crack something that gives you more than 40% organic retention? Or acquisition is more than 40% at least in an organic manner.
Retention. Anupam, question this
Yeah.
way.
I have a
talk to
question.
you.
Yeah, I have a question, sir. How deeply you get involved into the companies in which you invest?
So
into
yours,
the management of the companies, rather.
So let me describe to you my ideal investment, right? Let me describe to you my ideal investment. I give you 10 lakhs today. We never talk for 3 years. 3 years later, you give me back 10 crores. That's my ideal investment, right? So I would prefer not to get involved. The point is that I'm making is I get involved when I'm needed to be involved. I am never involved in the management. I'm never involved in the operations. If there is an introduction the entrepreneur needs, then I'm happy to make it. If they want to bounce off an idea or they need a sounding board, I'm happy to be that. Happy to get involved in discussions around strategy, but operationally and management-wise, I'm almost never involved.
What generally I've seen is that the tussle between management and the investors. Management wants investors to stay out, and investors normally want to get into the details of how your quarterly performances are happening, and why you're not performing, why the break-even is not coming. So there is a huge tussle. So do you feel?
No, I think you're making a very valid point, but those are different stages of a company. I come in as an angel investor. We typically own 1, 2, 5, maybe sometimes 10% of a company as an individual investor. And we invest, I've made some large investments, but typically it would be 20, 30, 40, 50 lakhs in a company. And so to impose management involvement or interference at that point is not the best strategy to make returns from an angel investment. However, I think Sandeep might be able to lend some color to that. When Sandeep and the VCs come in, right, and over time they end up putting in $30, $40 million into a company, and they own a significant share of the company, they have LPs and investors to answer to. So if those entrepreneurs are not making the right decisions or they need help in execution and operations, then that's what they need to do. They need to discipline them and make sure that they govern them. But maybe you have something more to add, Sandeep.
I think you've covered the points. Let's move on to the next question. Yeah.
So as entrepreneurs, how do we approach our business strategy? Should it be steady growth, steady marketing, steady profits, or should it be, looking at the circumstances, should it be aggressive marketing, aggressive growth, maybe at higher risk? So what should be the correct strategy to...
Look, I wish there was one formula that fit all sort of businesses. Unfortunately, there isn't. I think it depends on 2-3 factors. It depends on the industry, and it depends on the competitive intensity, the industry, and your personal aspirations. These 3 things will determine how aggressive you want to be, how much money you want to burn, and how you sort of carve your business strategy.
So great. I think this has been wonderful to have a very engaged audience. If there are any other questions or interactions, Anupam is around, so you can come up and speak to him. I'd request Amol, another entrepreneur and startup committee member, to come and say a few words of thanks and close the session for the day.
And I think before Amol comes, I want to ask him a couple of questions. At IMC we also have, one of the things we do is to be, advocates to the government of what we can do. And, I'm sure every entrepreneur will say there's much the government can do. Every one of us who's a VC will also say that, there's much the government can do. If you had an audience with Mr. Modi or the Chief Minister, what are the 3 things you'll ask to fuel our ecosystem, to fuel our startup? Some of the things you mentioned about, for example, in the advertising or creating equally level fields, and especially for Mumbai as a startup hub, what do you think we can do to really, encourage more entrepreneurship, maybe in certain sectors or so on, in Mumbai? These are the 2 things that, at IMC we really, want to push as an agenda. And what is the one really big thing that you think is really wrong with our ecosystem? So 3 questions, quick answers, and I hand it over to Amol.
Okay, so let me break down the questions. So the first question is, besides what I feel about FDI into digital companies, which is my number 1 thing that I would ask the government, what else would I ask,
Yes.
Mr. Modi? I think the most important thing after that is then incentivizing investments into startups. I think we have a bit of a regressive policy in this country. We actually have an angel tax even today. Yes, companies find ways to get around that, but what is the need of an angel tax, which is if a person makes an investment in a company, that company theoretically and technically could be taxed for raising that money, right? Most other countries, you take the example of Chile or even the UK, they actually give you tax breaks for angel investments. So I think that is something that we need to make as a very important agenda item. I understand there are some people who take advantage of these loopholes, but you don't, retard your entire ecosystem to penalize those few people. So I think it needs to be thought of more progressively as opposed to regressively. So that would be probably one important agenda item for the government. Closer to Mumbai, what do we need here? There's so many things. On the positive sides, Mumbai has great power, availability, better infrastructure than a lot of cities. But on the other side, the cost of living is very high. There's not enough tech talent. So if you had to kind of boil it down though to one thing, how do you accelerate the startup ecosystem in the city? I would put it down to one thing. If we could get one catalyst company, in whatever means, whatever it takes, in terms of incentives that we have to provide to this company, to set up shop in Mumbai. When I say catalyst company, I mean a very large company, a unicorn that employs at least several, let's say 4,000 or 5,000 people. If we could somehow get them to move to Mumbai or finance an upcoming company that would be stationed in Mumbai, I think that itself would take care of a lot of
All we need to do is get Ola to return to Bombay.
Get what?
Get Ola
to return to Bombay. Right. So I think we need a catalyst company. Right. So if you look at most ecosystems in the world, you've seen that catalyst companies are what ultimately drive the ecosystem, around which then a whole ecosystem gets created. Right. So that would be my short answer to that question.
So, Amol, could you give the vote of thanks? And Anupam, thank you very much. It was been I have learned a lot. And thank you for sparing his time to come and spend time with us.
Thank you. That was really inspirational. So good evening, everyone. It's really been a fascinating talk with some valuable insights on what is a part of entrepreneurial journey. Grit, commitment, passion, a lot of self-belief, all culminating into what he calls perseverance. Thank you for that. Thanks, Anupam, for being here with us, sharing a snapshot of your journey from being a family businessman to a brash individual, as he calls himself again and again, to a successful entrepreneur and now a prolific investor. He obviously achieved a great work-life equation in the balance, right? You have shown often, that's often the best ideas come from daily life. Your first idea, Shaadi.com, indeed revolutionary. But what's made you different is that you see things that happen, or what makes entrepreneur difference is you see what happens in daily life, and you know how to capitalize them, how to make something out of it. And I think you've presented 2 or 3 wonderful examples of what you have done. Shaadi, Ola, to name a few of them. All of us have got motivation, grit, determination. All of us have it. That's required to succeed as an entrepreneur. I want you all to think about what motivates you. What is it that you're passionate about? Who knows? You start a journey, one day your path will cross with Anupam. You may be able to convince him, excite him to invest in your company and help you leave a mark in the world. I want to thank all of you to be here. Thank IMC for arranging this wonderful session. And thank you, Anupam, again, for sharing your lovely insights of your life. Thanks.